All right, I think we have quorum in the room, so let's get started. Hello, everyone. I would just like to welcome you to today's session organized by VODAN Africa. This is the third installment of the Metadata for Machines workshop, and we're excited. At least we are making some good headway. My name is Charles Kahiro, and I am the Creative Director at TravelWorks Africa, which is a management consulting firm specializing in organizational management, learning, and development. Now, for today's session, as you can see from my shared PowerPoint up there, is led by Eric, who's the International Science Coordinator at the Go Fair International Support and Coordination Office. And for today's session, we'll be trying to set foundational notions that will be used in the upcoming sessions, mainly by making sure that one, we are aligned on the concept of metadata, and we will cover some of the outcomes of the skills and scoping surveys that had been rolled out in the previous sessions, as well as Eric in due time will give us an outline of the metadata structure that will be implemented in the fair data point or the various fair data points being deployed by the country teams. So just for some housekeeping during the presentation, let us have our mics muted to prevent background noises from disrupting the flow of the presentation. So if you have not done that just yet, take some time to do that right now. Also, as always, we do like to hear from you. And on that note, if you do have any questions during the presentation, feel free to type them in the chat box. You can see that on the Zoom panel, and then I will bring them up during the presentation. Just so you know, we will have a session, or we will have some time at the end for question and answer. So feel free, don't panic if something goes wrong, or if there are any delays, or we are not able to address your question during the presentation, be sure we will get to it at the end, and we'll give everyone a fair chance to ask their questions. So to start off, let me just share my screen here. We are going to start off with a simple example on metadata that hopefully will help us understand the machine actionable concept in a broad but familiar way. And then later Eric will do a deep dive into it as the session progresses. So here we are just taking some COVID research and evaluation data that was shared by Harvard. This was done actually this year, or earlier this year, here in Nairobi, Kenya, assessing the knowledge, attitudes, and practices in urban slums. And as you can see, as part of the data set, we have multiple files, just a few, around 7. But in here, we also have a metadata panel, and it's mainly covering all the citation metadata, as well as some geospatial metadata and social sciences oriented metadata. So I know sometimes when we talk about metadata, individuals are not quite, we may be too abstract for us to get it. But what we are talking about is, this is a familiar analogy to what the metadata that Eric is talking about. This is only covering the citation portion of this data set. But as you can see to the left, you have different fields. And it's easy for us to read it because it's all in English, or at least in human language, as we can put it, which would be persistent IDs to make sure that the data set is findable if you are looking for it. When was it published? We know who it was published by because we have a list of authors there and the organizations they come from, as well as some descriptive information here on what is contained in the data set, more or less. In addition to other stuff like geographic coverage for the data, when the data was deposited, some keywords associated with it. Now, when we talk of machine readable data, here, if I export it to a standard, let's say the doubling go, this is what it would look like. The markup language here is XML, but for whatever we are using for the fair data point is RDF, but the point is more or less the same. You will see in black the text that normally we would be able to understand as regular human beings, but everything that you are seeing here in pink and some things in blue, mainly hyperlinks, are more or less oriented to the machine, so that the machine can understand the text that is being offered to it. Now, when you see the structure of the metadata that Eric is going to share afterwards, most of it is oriented around links. So if you're talking about a publisher, it will be a link either to a resolvable link to the publisher. If you're talking about persistent IDs, it will be more or less the same because we are pushing the findable concept around it. And most of it won't be what you can read, but it'll be a lot of hypertext link. But when we are talking about metadata, these concepts around either the IDs or the publications or the authors or the titles, the things that we need to consider, whether it be for the data point or the catalog or the data set underneath, because the metadata has its own, will be categorized in layers. These are the things that we need to think about, whether we are technical individuals or not, so that that can be, those are the parts of the metadata that we will edit into the fair data point. I hope this helps us to have a familiar starting off point for all of us, even as Eric takes us through the rest of the presentation. So with that, I will hand over to Eric, and I'd like to appreciate him for doing this for us once again. Thank you, Eric.
Hey, thank you, Charles. And indeed, a really nice overview and introduction to just, kind of a snapshot of what we typically think of as metadata and how it obviously has, great value to us because, like I say, in fair data, sometimes metadata is even more important than the data itself. It tells us a lot about the project and gives context and helps us to make sure that this data finds reuse. So, I very much like your use, Charles, of the Dataverse example, because this is pretty familiar. It's about research articles and data sets that are connected to them. So maybe it's familiar ground for everyone. And certainly when we step to the fair data point, I think we can say the main objective, the thing that makes the fair data point different than, say, an ordinary repository, is that it attempts to secure certain connections between these data elements and between the machine readability of these elements, so that we can realize more of the FAIR principles. And the FAIR data point was created, specifically guided by the FAIR principles to try and ensure that we could capture all the behaviors that are described in the principles themselves. So I have, I think, 22 slides here. And if we have time, I'll come back in detail to some of the FAIR data point metadata and take a look at it very much in the way that Charles just showed it for us. But let me remind us all where we were last week. We're in this process now of completing 8 weeks of metadata for machines workshops. And as of last week, this is how we were looking at the potential agenda here. On the 5th of May, we were talking about the FAIR principles themselves and the metadata that they are more or less requesting. And we gave a homework assignment to try and prompt everyone to think about the FAIR principles and what they're asking for, and to try and sketch your own ideas of what that might mean. We thought that depending on how that went, today or in the near future, we could begin to compare your analyses and begin to see overlaps and parallels, and that would lead us to begin formulating for our purposes the metadata that we would want to focus on in this VODAN project. And if we eventually get to a point where we have that focus and we've decided what it is we want to do, then we could begin to actually implement that metadata into some kind of machine actionable code. And we thought that might come later. However, from last week until now, we are analyzing the skills survey that we sent out last week, where we asked the participants to just kind of indicate to us your skills in data modeling and your familiarity with controlled vocabularies. And we also took a look at the scoping exercise that you've done. And I should also say we were by now anticipating some results on attempted deployments of the FAIR data point itself. This is following the presentation from Luis and Case, I think now almost 2 weeks ago. And because we haven't heard much from the deployments of the FAIR data points, we started to think, well, maybe we need to reconsider the agenda here, and maybe we need to make a course correction. So in a couple of discussions, we thought, well, let's go ahead and kind of alter the expectation here. Let's maybe consider setting up country teams with technical leads in each team. So this would be essentially taking the participants on this call, grouping you all into teams related by country, and then with maybe the support of a few key technical people that are picking up the metadata aspects of this, we could begin to actually deploy the FAIR data point. That would be the goal. And it has always been that we wanted, we saw that there would be maybe one or more FAIR data points deployed in each of the 6 countries that are in the project right now. And the idea would be that we would have these FAIR data points per country, because in each country there are local governance and regulations on patient data. So we think it's important to focus at the country level, but we also wanted to, in this course correction here, to focus on the FAIR data point deployment itself. The reason is the FAIR data point, as Luis presented it, the FAIR data point in a box, it actually comes with some rudimentary metadata built into it. And so when we deploy that FAIR data point, it will automatically prompt the user to enter some metadata. And we think that might be the best introduction to the FAIR metadata components. Once we have that FAIR data point up and running with these basic metadata elements in there, we can then come back to the other FAIR metadata components that we talked about last week. So what are we doing today then? I want to review for you the survey on the skills that we did. We'll mention a little bit about the scoping exercise, and we would like to run a real-time poll today just to see, in fact, who has actually deployed a FAIR data point. And if there are some of these FAIR data points running, that could be really helpful in figuring out how we proceed from here. But given that review, we will then, as a goal today, try to form teams by country, identify technical leads, and this team will be focused first on the deployment of the FAIR data point, and then second on the elaboration of the metadata around it. And if we have time, we can also come back to some questions that some of you supplied when you registered for the webinar today. And I'll come back to that at the end. Okay, so here's the skills survey from last week. If you remember seeing that in the link, 12 people, so 12 of you responded to that survey from 3 different countries. And this was the background of the people who actually responded to the survey. So very much from a technical background, it looks like. And so this is already telling me maybe a little bit about the composition of the people on the call today. It may be that there were not more people responding to the survey because maybe some of you felt that the technical skills for metadata are something you don't have, and maybe even given your current role in life, you don't anticipate gaining these skills anytime soon. And that's perfectly all right. But I think what's useful for us is to begin to identify people who either have the skills or are willing to gain them over the next couple of weeks or months. And let me just show you what the survey looked like. Basically 3 questions focusing on 3 different elements. So the first was skills in data and metadata modeling. So actually building a conceptual model that has all of your data elements interrelated in some meaningful way. The second was experience working with controlled vocabularies. That's the middle. And then the third is kind of combining, excuse me, combining these 2 together so you can actually write computer actionable code that describes your data and your metadata. And what we see from this first result, this first question, you know, do you have experience with these things? So half the respondents said that they have experience not with any of these things. I suspect we have half of the people, 6 people, conversant in data modeling because that's pretty standard in computer science. We asked another question, how would you rate your skills in each case? And what we see here is that, in fact, there was nobody rating themselves as advanced. And in each case, we were getting people responding with having no skills at all. And then when we asked, well, would you like to have training in these things? Everyone was pretty enthusiastic about that. So that's telling us that even among the people who might feel technically competent enough to take the survey, that they still are in need of some training when it comes to the details of this machine actionable metadata. And then the other exercise we commissioned last week was this scoping exercise. This was following my presentation where I just kind of presented metadata components that are requested by the FAIR principles. And I presented a spreadsheet that said, well, in each case, for each country, for each FAIR data point, and for me, I was assuming that there might already be a team assembled for this. How would you go ahead and answer these questions about FAIR metadata? And here's one example of an answer that came back. And I think this is a wonderful response. It's great to see Namobi thinking about each of these things in particular and taking a stab at how he would go ahead and try to answer these. And I just wanted to mention there were some questions in that homework assignment, like how do we fill in just mechanically, how should we do this? Should we fill in our answers on a separate spreadsheet or in that Google Doc? And I think the best thing to do is if you've completed your answers for this homework assignment, just go ahead and upload it to the Metadata for Machines work folder there's the link here. I'll show it again at the end, but we'll make sure that you can easily get to this drive so you can put your answers there. And then that way I'll be able to review them all together. And by the way, all of you can take a look at it as well.
We will also share the same link on the different platforms, the VODAN communication platform. So if you are unable to memorize the link, or screenshot it, or even find the presentation, we will share it in the com channels.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Charles. So given the results that we've seen so far in the survey, we started to conclude to ourselves that it's likely that we will probably have to rely on some people in the group that have the technical abilities, who would be able and willing to guide the other stakeholders in this group in the creation of their FAIR metadata. So I think we'd like to try and identify you technical leads out there who are able and willing to do this. In the second conclusion here, we also thought, well, let's shift our attention now as well from kind of a broad discussion on FAIR metadata. Let's get it much more focused and practical. Well, let's say we will focus our attention on the deployment of the FAIR data point itself, really trying to push this now as a priority, because following the presentation from Luis, where he talked about this deployment of the FAIR data point in a box, the FAIR data point already comes with a small metadata editor that will prompt you for some basic metadata. And by working with that editor, by seeing the FAIR data point in action, I think we can already begin to start getting a more concrete understanding of the metadata that's required. And once we feel comfortable with that, I think we can then return to this, to the broader elements of the FAIR data points, and return to these questions. Well, what other kinds of metadata do we feel will be important to include in this project? So the goal for today, what I would like to do on the webinar today, for this third webinar, is to set up the FAIR data point deployment teams per country. And I'll explain how we're going to try and do that. And this is something, by the way, that can continue on during the week, but let's try to see if we can get real concrete country deployment teams set up, and maybe even by next week we can have a FAIR data point running. So what I'd like to do is, to start this off, is turn this over to Ivy, who has prepared a real-time poll. And if you go ahead and complete the poll, I think it should be has already popped up on your screen. If you can complete that, if we can find people who have already deployed a FAIR data point or are ready to do that, then we would like to also ask you to enter your name in the chat window. And we will then be able to identify you as someone who's willing and able at least to set up the FAIR data point where you are.
Just to echo Eric's comments, following the FDP installation webinar that was run by Louise and Case, we just want to find out how many teams, or has anyone installed a FAIR data point following that, or at least have they tried? Are you in the planning stage of setting up your FAIR data point, or are you in the installation or mid-installation and you're having some technical issues? Or have you fully installed and deployed? From that, if you have fully deployed your FAIR data point, just write in the chat box your name, even your country as well, so we can know who's up and running already. I can see Getu from Ethiopia. They have installed a local fair data point. Can you hear me?
Yes, absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah, and this is So I'm really happy that we ran this poll, because this is giving us a lot of really nice information here.
Yeah, we can see 14 out of the 31 attendees have not yet voted. So if you can vote, by all means, go ahead. We can see 6 out of the 31 are yet to deploy or yet to start the deployment of the fair data point.
And this raises an organizational issue, I think, Charles,
Yeah.
that indeed we have 31 people.
Yeah.
At the same time, we have 6 or maybe 7 countries.
Yeah.
And so it's certainly nice that everyone is responding to the poll. I think what we will do then offline is to kind of categorize or at least kind of assess, which countries have a fair data point running,
Yeah.
and which ones do not.
Yeah.
And if that is because there are limitations due to just the technical skill base in that country, then maybe we can even advise technical people from one country that is successfully deploying a fair data point to assist in the other areas.
Yeah. Because ideally what we want for the country teams is to have sufficient technical expertise, whether it's domiciled in the country or we can assign you someone from outside, so that they can help you or offer support to help you get your FDP up and running. So to add value to the metadata discussions going forward. I can see in Tunisia, their data steward just joined last week. So at least they're starting it off. For Nigeria, not yet. I know I can see Susan highlighting that she's having some technical issues with her Docker container. So that one counts as in process. That's good. So at least now we know, we have an idea of where everyone is and we are able to adapt accordingly.
Yeah, this is very nice.
There's someone who had unmuted their mic. Did you have a comment or a question? All right. So based on the results so far, we have 37% not yet started. Another 37% is in the planning stage. We have 16% of all respondents being in process, and then 11% being fully deployed. So, and from the responses, we can say those are 2 full deployments.
Yeah, wonderful. Yeah, congratulations, everyone.
Yeah.
Very nice.
So it's good, at least we can see some work is actually going on in the background. What we are hoping is by the session next week, we will have fully running installations or deployments for every country program or project. So we can be able to move forward more or less.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay.
I see Dr. Reginald highlighting that they are also in the planning stage for Kenya, and they are ready as a team for training on how to continue with the deployment. So Eric will talk about the teams as envisioned going forward later in the presentation, and then we will see how that works.
Yep, super. Okay, so I'm going to move ahead with a couple more slides here to show where this is going. Um, and so is it correct, Charles, then that we maybe close the poll right now, or we leave
Yeah,
it
the
open?
poll is closed already.
Good.
If you're seeing the window for the poll results, you can just click on close. There's a handle at the top right uh, of that overlay window, and then you can be able to see the slides.
Yeah, super. Okay, so I'm going to return to some slides here. And I'm going to now sort of comment directly to the people who have been working directly with the FAIR data point. When you have a successful deployment, I think you see something like this. Again, this is my own personal FAIR data point on my laptop. And you can see there's the FAIR data point. I'm showing catalogs here. This is because the FAIR data point has a metadata structure built in based on what's called the data catalog vocabulary, the DCAT vocabulary. And that's a W3C standard. So it's a nice structure to follow because it's coming from this particular organization. But because we use DCAT, it means that the metadata on the FAIR data point is hierarchically structured. And at the highest level, we have the FAIR data point itself. And within the FAIR data point, there are one or many catalogs, data catalogs. And within a data catalog, there will be one or many data sets. And what I'm showing here is a proposal for how we, in this VODAN project, could structure our metadata components in the FAIR data point. At the highest level, at the FAIR data point itself, I think it's nice to describe our FAIR data point using both the VODAN designation and also the country designation. VODAN, whether it is this particular project or it is the GoFair implementation network, and maybe just to remind us too that VODAN is an acronym for the Virus Outbreak Data Network. And this is an implementation network in GoFair. There's over 170 people involved. There's 16 cluster groups. So pretty intense energy and interest in VODAN at the moment. And I think any FAIR data point constructed following the implementation strategies of VODAN could rightly be called a VODAN FAIR data point. But it's also important to designate the FAIR data point by country. And again, this is because each country will have, rightly so, its own laws and regulations governing, especially access to private information and patient medical records. So I think it makes a lot of sense to identify the FAIR data point at the level of this project, VODAN, and country. Then one layer down, I think it would make a lot of sense if there was a catalog that was the clinical organization that was actually collecting the clinical case report forms. I'm saying hospital here, but maybe it's a smaller clinic or some other kind of medical setting. But in any case, we can have a one or many catalogs under the FAIR data point, one for each clinical organization collecting data. And then at least we know where these data are being collected. Within a catalog, we will have a data set. And of course, the focus in this project is on the electronic case report form. So I'm proposing this as the structure. What I'm listing here, as far as metadata goes, is what the FAIR data point would call the publisher. And so in this case, The VODAN would be the publisher of the FAIR data point. The hospital would be the publisher of the catalog, and also the publisher of the electronic CRF. All of this in more technical detail is spelled out in this GitHub repository, which describes the metadata specification of the FAIR data point. So it just takes you through that. And I have the link to that GitHub here. And really for the technical people, you might, I'm curious already in setting up the FAIR data point, you may have already encountered this structure in the metadata editor of the FAIR data point. And I'm wondering if this is making sense to you, and maybe even if this is how you've already begun to set up your FAIR data point. Maybe one more way of looking at this more graphically, there's different hospitals. They each are collecting case report forms. The hospital can be responsible for those data as they are any patient data. And then the country level VODAN FAIR data point will contain metadata descriptions of those electronic case report forms, and we'll point to them using the globally unique and persistent identifiers that are part of the FAIR data point. So that's the other way of looking at it. And let me do the following. I'm just a little bit hesitating here. I'm looking at the time. And what I will do is I'm going to share a different screen. I'm actually going to go to the data, to the GitHub. And I think you can see this now. This is me in the metadata specification of the FAIR data point. And I hope this is a little bit familiar given the introduction that Charles gave us. This is basically just a description of the metadata elements as they've been sort of proscribed already in the FAIR data point. Later, we can add additional elements as we wish. But let me just take you through what you see here, because it'll, I think, relate to what Charles mentioned earlier, and help us to see why getting the FAIR data point going could take us a long way down the road to helping us with our metadata. So this is just the table of contents I'm looking at here. And you can see the layered structure of the FAIR data point. There's a metadata layer of the high-level FAIR data point itself. There's the metadata in the catalog, and then the data set. And then there's another layer called distribution, which is something like file format or file type, but it's just saying that your data set could be in multiple different representations, and the distribution tells us what that representation is. If I look now at this description of the highest layer, the FAIR data point itself, what you see is that there is a controlled vocabulary or an ontology from which we have chosen metadata descriptors. And so, for example, there's RDF. So we're choosing to write everything in an RDF code. There's an ontology called DC terms, Dublin Core terms. There's a FAIR data point ontology. There's an RDF schema, and there's the re3 data ontology. And so if we go, for example, to the DC terms, you see that there is one DC term called publisher. This is actually required in the FAIR data point. And this is the organization that's responsible for running this FAIR data point itself. And it's asking for a link to that organization. That's the IRI. And so the way we see publisher here in the DCAT terminology, this is really, in a way, kind of the FAIR data point owner, the person or the organization that's responsible for running this thing. But there's other things. There's the language that's being used here. There's the license that regulates the usage of the fair data point. These are, in this case, set to optional. If you look down here, there's a link to the metadata identifier. This is required, and this is something unique to the fair data point. This is the identifier of the metadata itself. And this is just allowing all the different layers of the fair data point to be interconnected through links. And that's, it seems like a simple idea, but this is one of the things that makes the fair data point so special. And so those are kind of the, the human level descriptions. And then here's what things look like actually in the RDF code. So here's the DC terms publisher. And in this example, it's the research group that I belong to at the LUMC. But this could be, for example, a link to the VODAN community. And it turns out, by the way, my colleagues and I have actually created a unique identifier for the VODAN community, but we can come back to that next week. And then here you see, here's a link to the data catalog. And that takes us down to, for example, the metadata layers of the data catalog. And again, you see a bunch of ontologies, a bunch of metadata records, some of them required, some of them optional. But you will be prompted to complete these when you boot up your fair data point. And so here's the metadata structure of the catalog. And there will be links in here that eventually lead us to the data layer. And so on. So again, conscious of the time, I don't want to spend too much time here, but I just want to alert you to the fact that there are some basic metadata records here that can help get our fair data point operational pretty quickly. And that's what we want to try and focus on in the next week. So I'll come back to the slides here. And so given the very nice results from the real-time poll, and then also talking with Francesca about the overall organizational structure in VODAN Africa project, what we'd like to do going forward is to leverage these existing team organizations where we have in each country a country lead, and then also the technical lead or the technical support. And what we'd like to do is for everybody on this call right now to go to a Google spreadsheet. And I'm just going to reuse the same spreadsheet that we used last week. It's this M4M scoping exercise, but I created a new sheet called FDP deployment teams. So it's I don't want to give you a whole other link to deal with, but you can go to the same spreadsheet. If you go to the deployment teams, you will then see that we've already begun to lay out each of the country teams with the country lead, the technical support, and what we would like you to do, if you're listening on this call right now, is to complete this list by putting your name under the country that you are participating in. And we'll call you the stakeholder representative, because I suspect many of you will be the people who will eventually return to the hospitals and secure some of the needed metadata that we're going to need to really complete the schema for the fair data point. That's the basic content. So to summarize what we've done today and what we would like to do for next week, your to-dos are to make sure your scoping exercise, if you've completed it, you can go ahead and put that on the metadata for machine work folder. And I want to stress too, I hope the exercise is interesting and thought-provoking. If you don't consider yourself a technical metadata expert, I still think there's a good reason to just take a look and at least familiarize yourself with the components, because again, it's a lot of these issues are very content-oriented, and we're going to need policymakers, physicians, scientists, researchers, scholars. We're going to need your expertise in completing these metadata. And then the other thing I would like is to is for you to sign up for your country fair data point deployment team, and you can do that at the scoping exercise. Next week, given that we maybe have stabilized some working fair data points, we can try to review what that deployment looks like per country. We can try to see if there's been any blocks, if there are, how we can overcome them. And then I think we probably, if we can achieve that, then we're in a position to do more of this, a more thorough walkthrough on the embedded fair data point metadata. And we can come to a consensus between the metadata elements that may be in common between all the countries, and then find solutions for the metadata elements that will be specific to each country. So that will be the plan for next week. Lastly, I just want to mention, that when you register for these webinars, there's an opportunity to leave questions. These were the questions from last week. And now here's a set of questions from this week. So how to create a semantic data model for the fair data point. Could you please elaborate more on the R1 principles? And this is a pretty detailed question having to do with, really this governance and responsibility ownership issues. And I just briefly went over that when I was talking about the publisher of a fair data point. So these are great questions. What I think I'm going to do going forward is either compose written statements for these and then share them offline with you. That might be a better way to do it than live on a webinar like this. On the other hand, if it's useful to have visuals and it's convenient for people to follow, maybe I can also do some recorded videos as well, just private webinars, and then we can release the video that takes us through these questions. Because I think in general, it's hard to squeeze these in at the end of a 1-hour webinar when we're already dealing with a lot of complex issues otherwise. So I will leave it there. And because we do have, 8 minutes here, if there's any questions, I'm happy to entertain that now, or comments, as you like.
Yes, if you have any questions, comments, opinions, this would be the time to voice them. If there is something you need clarified from the presentation, this would be the time.
Hi, Charles.
Hi,
this is
Professor.
Miriam speaking.
Yeah, nice to have you.
Thank you, and thank you for excellent hosting, and also for Eric for very clear presentations again. It's really very, very much appreciated. And I just wanted to take this opportunity to welcome the full team from Ethiopia, Addis Ababa. I just like to give them a really very, very warm welcome here in the VODAN Africa training. And it's really amazing how everything has come together. And the same I'd like to say for the Kenya group. I've had a very full briefing of both Professor Some and Dr. Reginald Nulagala, and very exciting to see how the whole team is coming together and the diversity that is also contained in that, and in both countries very high level representation also from Ministry of Health. So just wanted to say welcome to everybody, and especially to these two groups that are in full attendance today. Thank you, Charles.
You're welcome. Karibu sana to the team from Kenya and Ethiopia. It's nice to have you here. Good thing is, as you can see, the links are up there on the screen. Please make sure that you sign up for your country's FDP deployment team. I believe Eric can put up the slide again showing who your tech leads are and who your coordinator will be. As well as, like we showed in the slide, we have a stakeholder section in the Google Sheet. So maybe you represent the Ministries of Health or a hospital that will partner with the country project. Just put your name down there so we can be able to tell the constituents of the teams. It doesn't mean it's only the software engineers that need to put up their names. Anyone who essentially considers themselves a member of the VODAN country team. For the deployments, I believe the country leads and the tech support will work hard in the next few days to make sure at least by next Tuesday, when we are meeting, we will have some form of deployment ready to go. So we can get or at least we can delve deeper into the metadata structure as highlighted by Eric. We have a question in the chat box. So from Susan, in Uganda, we have other virus outbreaks that occurred before COVID-19. So e.g. Ebola, the Nording syndrome. Can the FAIR data point be set up to accommodate that?
Absolutely. And if I go back to, say, this picture, or let's just go back to this picture. So we have a FAIR data point. We could call this the VODAN FAIR data point. It's in a particular country. There's a clinical source of this virus data, whether it is Ebola or Nodig syndrome or COVID-19. And there could be case report forms for any of those diseases. So indeed, the way I would see this is that in the VODAN FAIR data point, there's a particular hospital, and within that hospital, there is a data set for the case report forms for COVID. And then it's a decision, do we have other data sets for other diseases? If so, then what we do is we will compose the metadata that describe the data set such that rather than referring to COVID-19, it will refer to these other diseases. And the case report forms may or may not follow, in this case, the WHO standard. And in fact, we can even imagine data sets that are not even case report forms. There could certainly be other kinds of data, even just pure biomedical data like sequencing of the virus or genetic variants in the humans, et cetera. So indeed, the FAIR data point could be repurposed for other diseases. And it's, to me, a kind of an open question because the FAIR data point is so new. I'm very curious how the community will begin to deploy FAIR data points because they're pretty lightweight, meaning that they could be deployed even like, on a researcher at a university could deploy his or her own FAIR data point. The university could deploy one. We chose here, or we may end up choosing here that we want these FAIR data points to represent some kind of national level interest. But how the FAIR data points are used at the high level and then both in structuring the metadata within there is kind of an open question right now. And the work coming out of this project, VODAN Africa, is giving the world, I think, its first snapshot at what a serious structured fair data point is going to look like for real world data.
Eric, if I may, Charles, I know the time is up, but I just wanted to flag that in some of the fair data points, there will definitely be relevant COVID-related data that are not perhaps showing as medical data, but which would still be very relevant in terms of tracing of COVID. Especially, I believe that will be the case in Tunisia and Kenya. So maybe that's also something that you should consider in the setting up of the fair data point.
So Miriam, it would be great to maybe to learn a little bit more about that interest right now, because it may affect how we choose to set up the metadata components at each layer. So yeah, it's pretty relevant, I think, and would be nice to have sooner rather than later.
Yes, we'll discuss that. I think that has become clearer since the last training and the information I received yesterday and today. So,
and indeed,
we'll follow that.
Yep, in about an hour from now, I'll actually be on a call with the Leiden University Medical Center that is doing exactly the same thing. They will be setting up the VODAN Dutch fair data point for the Leiden University Medical Center to capture information on the COVID-19 case reports. And this is a research university hospital, and they tend to have lots of data about lots of different things. So I think there's probably already discussions at LUMC as well. You know, how do we begin to capture patient data, viral data, other kinds of biological samples, specimens, etc.
Charles, Eric, I just have this Francisca. I have just two quick comments.
Yeah.
The first one,
Yes.
the first one is on the skills survey that Eric sent out last week. The form is no longer accepting responses, but we still have new people who are joining the project. Like we just had a team of about 5 people from Kenya recently. So I'm gonna just request that you keep the form active so that as new people join, we share with them, and then the skills survey continues. That's one. Then two, we have sub-country channels on Slack for all the countries. So I'm just going to request from Eric, I know you're very busy, but there are a lot of questions that come up during the course of the week. If you can continue to relate with the individual countries through the Slack channels, it will be a good way on the FDP and the metadata M4M, for example, so that if there are questions, and they can also shape your presentation for the coming week.
Yeah, very good. And indeed, just to mention as well that I think once we have defined the country teams on the Google spreadsheet, that indeed the Slack channels may become the best source or the best mode for communicating within and then also between the teams. So absolutely. And yeah, it is challenging for me sometimes to keep track of the different channels of communication. But I think we can try to figure out a solution for that as well. Because indeed, if there's a lot of good questions there, maybe offline I can try to compile them and then respond to them. Like I say, it's some kind of, I don't know, maybe I can launch a little blog or something that can at least take a first attempt at answering these questions, but in a way that everybody can see it.
Oh, we have another question in the chat box. If a vocabulary is not fair, does it affect the fair data it defines?
Yeah, indeed. So what the effects might be, I think maybe a little bit unpredictable, but as far as good practice goes, if others cannot, well, let's say if computers cannot locate the vocabulary that you're using, we can imagine all kinds of ways that it could decrease the interoperability of any data or metadata that contains those vocabularies. And principle I2 is asking for vocabularies that are also fair. And one way to attempt to do this, and of course, this is maybe something we come back to later, but one way to do this is when you have chosen the vocabularies that you would like to use in modeling your data, there are now online resources that can evaluate the fairness of that resource. So if you have a vocabulary, if you have DCAT, for example, you can go to these online evaluation tools. You can enter the metadata, the URL to the metadata, the link to the metadata for DCAT. And these tools will run a series of checks evaluating each of the FAIR principles and then return a score, an estimated fairness score. And so there's actually a way to get a kind of quantitative estimation of the level of fairness of any resource, including vocabularies. So that if we, depending on the timeframes we have and if that's of interest, that's something that we can investigate and actually embed as some metadata in the FAIR data point. We can actually report that we score high on our vocabularies being fair.
All right. We have another one. Are there any particular vocabularies or ontologies that you are looking to use for this exercise?
So I am, in principle, I'm very agnostic. I have no preference for one type of implementation or the other, and it's really the communities of practice that should be making these decisions in the end. However, of course, just to get the ball rolling, we do in fact make decisions, and just the idea that we have chosen, for example, RDF as our interoperability language, it's already an implementation choice. It is a vocabulary, and it is something that we are choosing to use throughout the FAIR data point. The case report form that is part of the VODAN FDB in a box, that electronic case report form, it follows the WHO standard, but it's been rendered in RDF. And I think it's using primarily 2 different biomedical ontologies to do that. So indeed, we've already kind of begun to make implementation choices here. But what's nice about the FAIR principles is that it really leaves this freedom to operate to the domain user, because those are the people who know their data and their metadata best. So, we provide guidance, but we don't want to make any endorsements at the domain specific level. Yeah.
Or a follow-up on the same question, which ontologies are used in the electronic case report form?
Yeah, so let me see. They are 2 biomedical ontologies. They can be found in a repository called BioPortal, and I am going to locate them right now. Give me one moment, please.
While Eric is doing that, if you have any questions or you would like something clarified, be sure to type it in the chat box while we are nearing the close. So if you'd like to ask your question, now is the time to do it.
Yes, and I'm going to share my screen now. And what I'm showing right now is a prototype of what we call a FAIR implementation profile. And basically for each of the FAIR principles, we can list the implementation choices we've made to satisfy those FAIR principles. And I'm looking at I2 right now. We are using DCAT, the NCI Thesaurus, and the National Center for Biotechnology Information on Organismal Classification. So let me put this into the chat window so you have it. The NCI Thesaurus and the National Center for Biotechnology Information, those are the vocabularies that were used in the creation of the electronic CRF. And one thing that will come out of the metadata for machine workshop eventually is a detailed FAIR implementation profile for the FAIR data point and for all of these standards that we've chosen to use in VODAN. And this is why actually it's very important for us to, I think, identify the FAIR data point as a VODAN FAIR data point, because then it will immediately tell the world, tell the computers, the standards and technology implementation choices we've made. And it's just a declaration of everything that has to be interoperable if you want to work on this FAIR data point.
All right. I think we have covered all the questions so far. So I don't know, Eric, is there anything else you wanted to cover?
No, that's it for me. I know these presentations can deliver a lot of information. So I think this is a good time to close it off. And over the next week then, you know, if there is any blocks or if there's any other questions, you know, I would like to figure out a way that I can get to these questions in a more responsive way and get feedback. So maybe to the degree that I can get these questions, yeah, we can throw up a quick blog somewhere and we can at least put some preliminary answers there and some resources that might be helpful to people. And then also for those of you who are really, you know, got your hands on the FAIR data point and you're doing the technical things to deploy that, if you're running into blocks or problems, give a shout out and we can, if I cannot answer it, then we will go to Luis and his technical team and try to get answers for you. So I think it's, given the results of the poll today and everything else, I think we're pretty close to claiming FAIR data points running in the African VODAN project. That's pretty cool.
All right. Thank you, Eric, for your time. And I'd like to thank everyone else for taking the time to be with us here today. The recorded version of this webinar will be available on the VODAN Africa website in the course of the week. So in case you missed it or you came in a bit later, you want to review something, just be sure to check out the website. As well, remember to sign up for the next installment of the Metadata for Machines workshop, which will be on Tuesday next week. Please do try and have your FDPs up and running by then. The details and the timings for that session will be shared via the various VODAN African communication channels. By that we mean the Slack and the WhatsApp groups. Thank you again for joining us, and we will see you next time.
Great, thank you, everyone.
Thank you, goodbye.
Thank you, everyone. Goodbye. Thanks for the presentation.
And remember to sign up on the Excel sheet or the Google spreadsheet for the FDP deployment teams.